Hello, welcome to this episode of The Martial Truth, my interview with Scot Mertz Sensei about his new book, Ryuhoryu. Sorry there, camera angle. Ryuhoryu, Scot Mertz. Excellent book. Chock full of things. The first 60 pages on the history, well worth the investment in this book. It's got a ton of info in there. Really, really good. Everything from, a deep dive into the Okinawan history and how that all leads into the development of karate, to things like how to make chishi and other training devices. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it. I read it cover to cover. All right, so highly recommend. Think about getting yourself a copy. All right, we're living right now in times where we're getting a lot of good books and different things on Okinawan karate and martial arts in general. All right, so it's really really good. Want to mention again that I'll be in New York in 2 weeks for seminars. I'll be doing Ishinryu Karate all day on the Saturday and Chen Style Taiji Chuan Practical Method all day on the Sunday. And I'll be working Thursday and also Friday. So you can contact James Waller. Again, his detail and information will be in the description section. All right. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. I'd like to see some new faces and meet some of you that actually watch the podcast and are fans of the channel. Be great to see you. So consider coming out for the seminar. All right. As always, couldn't do this without you guys. So please click that like, share, subscribe button. Consider becoming a member. We're over 15,200 subscribers already. So things are going great for the channel. We have a bunch more interviews lined up soon. So you'll be seeing those popping up also. And that's it. So without anything else to add, here's my interview with Scot Mertz Sensei. All right. So, Scot Mertz, welcome to the Martial Truth Podcast. Why don't you introduce yourself, give your background, let our viewers know a little bit more about you, and then we'll start talking about your new book.
All right. Hi, Sai. My name's Scott. I actually live in Okinawa. I'm a retired Navy guy. Been doing karate close to 40 years, maybe a little more. My background's actually in Gojuryu with Ryueiryu Kobudo, but I've been playing a lot with this Ryuhoryu concept for the last 20 years. So, yeah, it's in a nutshell.
Okay. So this is Scott's new book, Ryuhoryu by Scot Mertz. It's available on Lulu. Okay. I finished reading it about a week ago. I thought it was really good. I really liked it. You don't have to be a practitioner of Ryuhoryu. There is a lot of stuff in this book. The history section is phenomenal. Probably the most in-depth history section I've seen in a martial arts book on Okinawan karate. One of the things I'd like to talk about initially is Scott did something very unique with the photos of the masters in the book. And I'll let Scott explain how they did it because it's fascinating and it's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, we ran into an issue where there was a lot of karate people who were important, but they didn't exactly live when the camera was invented. So to compensate for that, instead of using this classical artwork that's been out there for the last 50 years or whatever, what we did is we tracked down members of their families and we got photos of them. So, like a good example is Matsumura Soken. So I talked to his great great grandson and then his brother and then his father who was alive. So we ended up getting about 5 photos of family members and just kind of mugshotted them, right? And then what we did is we blended them together as if it's like there's technology out there. We're using AI that'll let you put people together as if like these people had children.
Right.
And then we would take that and then age progress it. So it was really interesting on some of the results because it's some of the results actually resemble the drawings that we've had around forever, but it's like we didn't have an actual photo.
Right. Right.
And when I went back to the families, I was like, hey, this is what we came up with. Everyone was like, I don't know who this person is, but they're definitely related to us because they look like everybody.
Right.
So in lieu of actual photographs, we used AI to create the photographs that way.
Yeah. And what I like about it is you're clear on which ones were created by AI, which ones are actual photographs, which ones
Mhm.
are a combination using the family and whatnot. And it is amazing. looking at the way the photos are put together, I mean, it's a very clever idea. It's the first time I've seen it used in a martial arts book, right? Um, it really gives you an idea of what the person might have looked like, you know.
Yep.
And it's interesting because, like in law enforcement, originally you had the sketch artist, right?
Yep.
So the person would sit there and give a description, and the guy would, and then we had we had all these what they called identikits, where they had all
Mhm.
these different eyes, and you'd slide the eyes in, you'd slide the nose in, you know. And now it's computerized where they enter in all the description, and then the computer will create an image of the guy, and it's amazing how the image will be close a lot of times,
Yeah.
from people's descriptions. So yeah, it's very cool. I mean, the section on the beginning of the book, all the Okinawan history, um, I mean, is phenomenal. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really, really good. I mean, you did a really, really good job on that. And then combining it with the list of all the different masters and their
Mhm.
backgrounds and what we know of them, right? As much as we can know what we know of them, right?
Right.
Which is great. And and again, the way the whole book's laid out, I mean, I really like it. I mean, the it covers such a wide range. I mean, it's full of stuff. I mean, everything from the normal things, kata,
Mhm.
kihon, right? But also how to make chishi
Mhm.
and how to make the different training devices to use, which is great, right? And but how long did it take you to work on just the history part in the front of the book?
So it's like 40 pages, but those 40 pages probably took 2 years because we had to verify and reference everything. And this is the first time that I've done a book with so many footnotes on it. Because before it's like I would have some stuff and I would throw it in the back, but I didn't necessarily link it to which sections were which because
Right,
I wasn't thinking like academic book. I was
right.
thinking, oh, I'm writing this for my own guys. So I tried to go through and make sure that everything was sourced. And between sourcing and making sure that the timeline was in the correct order and everything, I said it took a long time.
Yeah. Well, it's worth it because it's really good. I mean, I was totally into it from the beginning. The whole history part was fantastic. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm an Ishinru guy and a Matayoshi Kobudo guy. I don't do Ryuhoryu, and I still think the book's phenomenal. I think if you're if you're studying Okinawan karate, I think it's a book you want to get.
Mhm.
I mean, just for like I said, if no other reason than that history part in the beginning. But there's a lot of other good stuff in the book. I mean, you know I know it's specific to the art that you're trying to create and get going here, right? um
Mhm.
so is that the main purpose of writing the book? Was it
Yeah,
to
it's
be a guide for your students that do Ruru?
It was, so I've actually done a few different books along the way for Ryuhoryu manuals.
Okay,
And it's interesting because when the style started off, it was really Gojuryu with a few extra kata. And
okay,
then those few extra kata ended up being more than the Goju kata.
okay,
And then it was kind of like refining those and figuring that out. And then it eventually evolved to the point where it could like stand on its own 2 feet.
okay.
So what started off as a side project, like great example, Niseishi was one of our first kata that came in.
Right,
And Niseishi is like a classical kata that was more than likely being taught like around Na, but it wasn't incorporated into Gojuryu. However, there's benefits to it. So I would teach it to my guys who are having issues with katas like Saifa. You teach them Nahan or you teach them Niseishi, and that would kind of give them an idea on how to move for the other kata. So
right,
it's like supplementary type stuff.
right,
But then when you end up and you got like 50 supplementary katas to 12 base kata,
right,
it's like, okay, we got to refine some of this.
right.
And that's what Ruhoru really was the refinement of that. And then we started looking at the time frames for all of it, like when it was developed and when it was being taught.
You're talking
So
about the
the
specific kata.
yeah, for
Okay,
each specific kata. And what the overall focus ended up being was in Ryukyu Kingdom era karate. And the only two kata that we have that are post Ryukyu Kingdom are the two Gekusai kata, and that's just because we needed some basics.
right,
Because you can't start somebody off with a somewhat advanced kata, So it's
right.
like teach them some basics and then let them go from there. So Of our 18 empty hand kata, 16 of them are Ryukyu Kingdom era kata.
Okay. And when you say Ryukyu Kingdom, we're talking what years?
So that's I'm roughly 1392 to 1879.
Okay, so and what's the oldest kata that you found? How far back is it possible that it goes?
Sanchin, and it looks like it's 1750s.
Okay. So again, most of the kata are post 1750, right?
Yes.
So I mean, I'm sure you when you first started, I know when I first started, we'd hear these kata are hundreds and hundreds of years old. Oh, these
Yeah,
katas
not
are
so
a
much.
thousand years old. And it's funny now, I mean, Jesus, I finished 46 years in April. I don't even like saying that, right? But
Yeah.
because it just means I'm old, right? But it's interesting now understanding how these things developed, which is they developed as techniques where me and you are
Mhm.
working on fighting techniques. Because again, common sense. If we're working on fighting, why would we only practice punching and kicking in the air?
Right.
From a combat standpoint, it makes no sense, right? But then what happens is these two-person drills, these two people fighting techniques, um, as weapons become more and more prevalent, well, then it's like, okay, well, we don't need it as much, but we like doing this stuff. So how are we going to preserve it? And they preserve it by forming these
Yeah.
single person kata, right? And in the Chinese arts, we have it too, like the sword forms we do in Chen Taiji, the straight sword and the broadsword. Those are both 20th century creations because they were still using those swords in the 1800s, right? Until
Right.
firearms really became prevalent. And that's when they decided, okay, let's preserve the techniques and create a solo form, right? And
Yep.
even the Chen style, I mean, we only have the Chen style form as far as I know, documentation is only 400 years old, around
Mhm.
400 years old. Um, but like my teacher says, he believes it's much older. So what's that much older? That much older would probably be two guys working on techniques, right? And
Yeah.
we see the
Well, I think
same.
that's where it all
Yeah,
came from too.
yeah, and that's why it's interesting. Like I just purchased the book, the Chinese Bubishi, that the guy from
Mhm.
Taiwan wrote, which is another
Yeah. Yeah.
excellent book. Reading the history stuff in that one, fresh off reading the history stuff in your book, really gave me a really nice comparison and overview of what was going on. You know, and so you're saying Sanchin is probably the oldest kata that you
Yeah.
think has been around. You know,
Yeah. Just because we can trace that one back to one of the temples over by Yangcheng,
okay,
and it looks like it was like 1750s or so when it was actually being taught.
okay.
So I can't find anything older than that.
Well,
Well, there's rumors of things older, but there's nothing that's documented that actually shows it.
okay. Well, it's interesting
And
because
that's why,
I was going to say it's interesting because Sanchin, when you look at it, and there's so many other forms you can compare it to in China that have a similar look.
right.
Where that's not necessarily the case with a lot of the other Okinawan kata, but Sanchin is one where I mean, you look at any crane form and you see similarities
Yep.
with Sanchin, which is kind of interesting, right? Um, but in Ishinru we only do the very basic Sanchin, the Sanchin
Yes.
where you step forward and step back. So, and then you look at it in Wichiru, and the Wichiru one looks a little bit, you could see the root maybe coming from something similar to like the feeding crane Sanchin, which is much more
Mhm.
combative. And, again, it's done with power and speed and not the slow breathing and all this stuff, you know? Um, so, so what about the other aspects of the book in terms of all the different kata? So how many kata are you actually practicing? Sounds like a
So
lot.
there's 36, yeah, there's 36 total kata.
Okay.
18 of them are empty hand and 18 of them are weapons.
Okay. And the
So it
weapons are
splits it in
primary.
half.
Okay. The weapons are from which school?
Well, they're kind of a combination of a few things.
Okay.
For the most part, it's Ryueiryu.
Okay.
The two Jo kata that we have actually come from Kojo Ryu.
Okay.
Um, I've got some Chinese weapons that came in from when I was training over in China, like
Okay.
the Kocho Sotos.
Okay.
But for the most part, I would say it's like 75% Ryueiryu Kobudo.
Okay. So yeah, it's interesting because obviously everybody knows Ryueiryu from uh the kata champion, right? Sakamoto
Yeah,
sensei, right? So, but I don't
hmm
think that many people have that much experience with the actual Kobudo of Ryueiryu. So,
right.
how far does the Kobudo go back? When did that start becoming prevalent, or when was that created as far as within the style?
Yeah. So a lot of it was kind of created over time. And it looks like most of it came back in the 1850s
Okay.
because you have Nakaima Norisato, who went over to China. It was him and Sakiyama Kitoku, and they actually trained at the Beijing Military Academy. So
Okay.
they were there doing their thing, but they were there during like the Opium War. So
Okay.
they're still dealing with Chinese cavalry and things like that.
Right.
So a lot of the stuff that we had, like a Ringa-1, for example, that weapon is actually a horseback weapon. So the cavalry used to use that. It was a
Okay.
Chinese cavalry weapon that was kind of incorporated in. So there was a lot of things that were kind of like that, but it looks like largely between about 1850 to about 1870
Okay.
for a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I say it's interesting because we do have a lot of more Chinese style weapons.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because
I'm sure you
Matayoshi.
probably noticed that.
Well, yeah, and Matayoshi Kobudo also. I mean, we have a couple of things that are more based out of China that a lot of the other Kobudo systems don't do in the same way. Like we have the shield and the machete, as opposed to the turtle shell
Yeah.
shield. So our shield is an actual shield with a brace here and a handle that we use, and we use the machete, and then we obviously have the Saruchin and the Sensetsu Kon. And
Yeah.
again, Matayoshi Kobudo is the same thing. I mean, it's developed and changed over time. I mean, Shimpo Matayoshi was obviously trying to, codify it a little bit more, get the curriculum where it was clearer instead of this guy doing the kata one way, that guy doing the kata another way, which you see in a lot of the old videos from Matayoshi Kobudo. You'll see one guy doing a Tinbei
Yeah.
form, and it's like, okay, well, I've never seen that Tinbei form. That's not the Tinbei form I learned. But again, I think they're trying to standardize things. So in the Ryueiryu, what weapons do they use?
Well, you're looking at the bow. Well,
Right.
they got a lot of weapons, to be honest with you. Yeah, Bojo, Sai, Toifa, Weku, Gama, Timbe. There's a whole bunch. There's Gusan,
Okay.
Ringoan, stuff like that. So yeah, it's interesting. Like even with our Timbe, so I'm using a turtle shell in the book,
Right.
but that's just because that particular shield was actually made for me by this a friend of mine in Russia who makes just some of the most amazing like Timbe you've ever seen. But our original Timbe,
Is
and this
that
is what
Evan? Is that
Kurashita
Evan?
Sensei had told me.
Is
What's
that
that?
Evan?
Oh, Igvini? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. He
So
he makes amazing stuff. So I
I
used it from him because
right.
of that.
Right. Well, I
Yeah.
have one from Don Shapland.
Ah, nice. I used to have one of those. I ended up giving mine to, I think I gave it to McCarthy Sensei.
Oh, yeah, I have it up. It hangs in my dojo. My students had it made for me as a gift, and it says Seishin-kan, the name of my school. So I have it
Nice.
hanging up here in Arizona. Um, so um, so in terms of Rueru, because again, it's a style I think a lot of
Mhm.
people don't know that much about. So it sounds like there's more of a Kobudo curriculum than there is an empty hand
Yeah.
curriculum.
Yes. There's
Okay.
way more Kobudo than there is empty hand kata.
Okay. Which and
The issue I think is there is that, yeah,
no, I was just going to
I
ask.
was gonna say
So
the
this
issue
art
is, yeah.
started. When did this art start?
Um, Officially as Ruiru
Right.
in 1968.
Okay.
But it was a tradition that was already being taught within the family
Right.
all the way back to the 1850s.
Okay. And so my guess would be that in the 1850s, obviously weapons are more important than probably empty hand. I mean, as anything
Yeah.
else, every system seems to be weapons dominant if it's developed during a certain time period.
Yeah.
Because, like my Kotori Shinto teacher has said, if you're down to using jujitsu on the battlefield, you got a
Yeah,
big
you've had a
problem.
bad day.
Yeah, you got a big
Yeah,
problem. So, I know we do these empty-hand arts and we put so much emphasis on them, right? But it's really, in ancient times, everything was weapons, 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 and more weapons. You know,
yeah,
um, and it was interesting. You had to be proficient or at least have a knowledge of a lot of different weapons because you didn't know what you're going to come up against on the battlefield.
exactly. Or you could be disarmed. You have to find something that just happens to be there.
Right, right, and pick it up and use it. So,
Yep.
so who did you start studying Ryueiryu with?
So it's actually through the Shodokan.
Okay,
So there's a backstory to this. It's just a little complicated that a lot of people aren't aware of. But Nakaima Kinko used to be really good friends with this guy named Tamaki Jui. And what they were doing is they were kind of trading, um, well, I'll say methods. So Tamaki Jui from the Segokan, who's a student of Higaseko, he had actually sent a whole bunch of his students to Nakaima Kinko to learn Kobudo. And this is all back in like the 70s. So like Mariyoshi Sitoku and all these guys. And they brought it back into the Segokan school of the Shodokan, which
okay,
is Gojuryu.
right.
So we only got the Kobudo. We didn't get much of the empty hand stuff. So mine comes from the mess of the people who kind of went and trained with Kenko Sensei and then brought it back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, it's interesting because back then you had a lot of that going on when it came to
Yeah.
Kobudo. Kobudo hadn't really been established as well yet, I don't think. I mean, within certain schools, I'm sure they've been around a long time. But again, as things became more modernized and I guess we'll use the term popular, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because you had Matayoshi Sensei teaching in many different schools. You had Taira Shinken traveling all over the place. Um,
Yeah.
teaching. I mean, obviously, both the founder of Ishinru and my teacher, Kichido Shimabuku, both trained with him. Um, so, you had these Kobudo guys trying to preserve this art and get it established and get interest in it, get people to do it. And it's
Yeah.
interesting because now Kobudo has become extremely popular.
Yeah. In even the modern competitions where they're doing Kobudo on Kobudo,
Right,
that's becoming popular, which is
right.
kind of shocking.
Right, right. So it's very interesting, And for me, certain of the weapons I find more interesting. For instance, like the sai, because the
Yeah.
sai obviously is more of a just like the jute in Japan, right? It's a law enforcement weapon. You see the
Yep.
sai, My first instructor when he used to tell us the idea that all these Okinawan weapons came from farm tools. And when I would ask him, well, what about the sai? He'd say, oh, they tie it to the end of a bow and spearfish. And, when I'm 15 years old, I just go, yeah, okay, right? No, that
Yeah.
sounds good, right? And then as I get older and I see guys actually doing spear fishing, and I'm like, boy, that spear looks like it's the lightest thing in the world because fish are
Yeah.
pretty fast. And I don't think you're going to use a nunti to spear a fish. But again, the sai was just a weapon, the same way the nunti was a weapon.
Yep.
These were never farming tools, you know. So, I mean, it's like the same nonsense, where karate comes from farmers creating it.
Well, I think that's largely a Japanese thing because they're like trying to talk down, saying all these Okinawan people, they're all farmers and peasants. And, and it wasn't actually based on fact. It was just, kind of disparaging the people.
Well, it's interesting because I travel in the Koru world also in Japan, right?
Yeah.
And an eighth dan in Jodo took me out to dinner one night, and he was complimenting me on the arts I'd studied,
Mhm.
and he said I'd made very good choices, and he said you study Koru karate, so
Right.
that's what he referred to as Okinawan karate. He referred to Okinawan karate as Koru karate. So
Yeah.
within the Koru world in Japan, they view the Japanese karate very different from the Okinawan karate. They view the
Yes.
Okinawan karate as that's the original, but in the same token, they look at the arts they're doing, which come from obviously warrior traditions that are, some of them are, Katori Shinto is 600 years old. And of course, they're going to look down on the Okinawan martial arts as a peasant
Mm.
art because they weren't
Right.
they weren't part of the so-called warrior class like they were, right? Meanwhile, now it's modern times, and to be quite honest, most of the Koru people I see, they wouldn't last 30 seconds with a karate guy
Yeah.
because they don't train for real empty hand fighting. I mean, they don't most of the Ryu only do kata, and
Right.
they never work where there's any type of realistic attack. Where at least with the in the karate groups, even if you're doing sport, at least you're mixing it up in fighting. Where a lot of the Koru, they don't do any of that stuff anymore.
Yeah. Well,
It's
I think that karate doesn't ever really fall under the Koru and Gendai classification
right,
because Okinawa wasn't even part of Japan when all
right,
that was going down.
right.
So, like, I usually look at it as like Ryukyu Kingdom era and post Ryukyu Kingdom era. So it's like you have
Okay,
Ryukyu Kingdom and then you have Okinawa.
right,
And most of it, I think, was actually developed during, like, after 1879.
right.
But there's elements in all of them that go back, into the Ryukyu Kingdom era.
Well, I think would have to. I mean, when you're talking
Yeah.
about just fighting techniques, I think
Mhm.
fighting techniques are ancient. Like a lot of times when I start one of my seminars, um, I say, well, how did self-defense start? I say, well, early humans sitting around a campfire, he's cooking his meal that he just hunted, and it took him 4 days to hunt this animal, and now he finally got it, and he's sitting there eating. And a guy comes up and asks him if he could share. And he tells him no. And the guy picks up a rock and crushes his skull and kills him and takes his food. But there's a
Yep.
third guy in the bushes watching, and he sees this and he's like, oh my God, this guy just picked up a rock and crushed this guy. So he goes back to his little group and, picks up a rock, and they start figuring out a way to defend against that because, that's human nature. I mean, the thing I think humans are very good at is figuring out a multitude of ways to kill each other. I mean,
Yeah.
the human race, they're good at that. That's the one thing I'll tell you they're good at. And,
Mhm.
you see the proliferation of martial arts styles and all the different ways. And, what I find interesting, because I do train in so many different arts, is I try to look for the common threads that go through all these things, the things that link all these combat arts together. Right. Um,
Mhm.
and when I find that common thread, I think it's a big deal. I mean, I think it's a big deal. And, one of the things, that I've done more now as I'm training longer is principle based.
Mhm.
In your book, you talk about a lot of different things. One of the things being that a lot of Okinawans only talk about Shinkuchi, but there's
Right.
other, right. So why don't you talk about that a little bit and explain those things? Again, this is all in the book with illustrations and everything else. I'm telling you, get this book. So
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, Chinguchi's an interesting one because a lot of those terms actually came from Okinawan dance.
Okay.
Which a lot of people aren't even aware of that. But like Gamaku is like, or Gamakuchi, however you want to say it, is based on your hip rotations. Chinkuchi is based on like when you're making impact, like locking everything on that moment of impact. Boxers actually are notorious for doing that.
Right.
They just don't call it Chinkuchi.
Right.
Then you have Seibochi, where you're using your spine as a power generator. Katauchi, where you're using your shoulder as a power generator. Jinechi, where you're pushing from the ground to make power. So there's a whole bunch of different power generators, but people get tied around the post with just, Gamaku and Chinkuchi. And it's like, well, that's only two of the five that are the classical ones. And it's so interesting to me that it seems like information was not passed down fully. So people are missing pieces.
Well, I think there's a few factors for that. When we look
Yeah.
at the first guys, the first generation guys that were studying on the island, they didn't speak the language. Okay. Um, we had just defeated their country in war. Are they going to necessarily trust us right away and show us and teach us the
Yeah.
deep stuff? I mean, do you know who Walt Van Gilson was?
Yeah.
Okay, so Walt Van Gilson told me that the Tatsuo Shimabuku had Okinawan only classes.
Mhm.
And Walt said he saw things done differently in those classes than he saw what Tatsuo was teaching the Americans. And I think the Americans, the early Americans would like to think they were being shown everything, but I don't think that's the case. And that's not a knock on them. A lot of times they take that as a knock. You're criticizing. No, you're not criticizing. You're stating what's pretty much a fact. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, The other thing I think is when it comes to dealing with Okinawans, all right, I think some Westerners don't know how to ask questions.
Yes.
And I also think they say things like they go up to the sensei and they go, "Well, sensei, is it like this?" And he just goes like this, right?
Mhm.
But that's not necessarily he's saying it's like that. They're just not saying no. They're just not saying, they're just shaking their head.
Yeah.
But I think you have to understand, you kind of have to be specific. You have to really be specific in asking questions to get that specific answer. And I think a lot of the first generation guys, being military, they're used to taking orders. So the sensei says, do this, they do that. I don't know how many of them were really asking a lot of questions. I think probably a lot of them weren't. Um,
Yeah.
but again, like I say all the time, without them, we're not sitting here having this conversation.
Hmm.
So,
Well, even if they were asking questions, there's a chance that they weren't asking in a way that the sensei would understand it
right,
too. So there is that part. I've been lucky because I mean I train with Toyama Sensei, and he's been pretty good about like just talking about everything that he experienced and knows and everything. You kind of got to find a teacher out here that you jive with.
right,
Is you can't just go to a dojo and be like, all right, I'm here to train.
right,
You got to find somebody you have like a personal connection with, and that's
right,
when you're actually going to get the most information.
right. Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing I think. I think people think they just go to Okinawa and they're going to get all the answers. And, it's just not the case, right? But I mean, it's
Not
not the
normally.
case here either. I mean, that's another thing I think in modern times that we as people that train in this stuff, we think, like, well, the teacher has to give us more info, but really it's on us.
Right.
I mean, we're the ones that have to train, and like my Tai Chi master says, well, you have to find the method that works for you. Not
Hmm.
the method that works for Scott or the method that works for the other guy. I mean, because the bodies are different, mentalities are different, So yeah, initially you're mimicking the teacher, but then at some point you've got to start to figure it out for yourself. Well, how do will I make this work for me? And it's interesting when you talk about the different power generating things because in Chen Tai Chi, we have a lot of these concepts. And it's interesting because when you talk about the concepts you were talking about, like
Hmm.
at the higher level of the internal art, all that stuff is kind of done at the same time.
Yeah, it
And
is.
the big thing with the Chen is it's based on a rotation.
Right.
And the rotation is creating torque in that body. And that's where the internal comes from. And in the beginning, obviously the torque, and this is what I say all the time, like um, I still see martial artists that are training a very long time, whether it be Okinawan karate or Kobudo, and I see a tremendous amount of hip movement.
Hmm.
And again, I get it, but at a higher level, that hip movement shouldn't be as pronounced. If you're coordinating
Yeah.
the whole body, like I had a student right before I left New York, I think I was doing Seisan Kata, and one of my senior black belts, when I finished, said, "Sensei, were you using your hips?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, it didn't look like you were using your hips." I said, "I know, because I don't have to do that big hip movement anymore to generate that power."
Hmm.
And the other thing that the Chen has taught me is the importance of restricted movement.
Yeah.
When you have smaller movements and you do it right, you can generate tremendous power. And my research talking to people like Walt Van Gilson, some of the other first generation students, Tatsuo would, like, in his kata that he created, where he comes out in Sun Tzu, like when he taught it, he'd bring the hand all the way back to the hip.
Right.
But the first generations guy told me they saw many times where he just punched right from where his hand is, you know.
Hmm.
And in some old videos we've seen of some of these old masters, that group of videos that was popped up several years ago, um, that the one guy in Okinawa put up. And when you look closely at some of those kata demonstrations, they weren't even concerned about chambering. I mean, they
Not
were
really.
punching for, and I've got to say, in my own martial arts, as I practice more and more, I don't concern myself with chambering like I used to. I mean, again, I think that's a reference point for the beginning, but I think once you get to a certain point, the movement should be natural. It
Yeah.
shouldn't be, you know. this stiff stuff we see a
Well,
lot of people
even in
doing,
the
you know?
older Gojuryu, a lot of times the chamber's like in more towards the center of the chest.
Right, right.
So it's not even
Now
back
you're
on the
seeing
side. It's like here.
you're seeing it over here, you know?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, you know, and I think some of the changes are for looks.
Yeah, it's purely aesthetic because it's going to
Right,
win a piece of plastic.
right. Exactly.
It's not about real self-defense.
No, no. And you know, that's one of the things that, you know, I preach this all the time. One of the things that concerns me with karate is that you know, it's going too far in one direction and losing its original intent. And you
Yep.
know, you know, if you lose the original intent, is it still karate? I mean, I guess it's
No,
karate, but what kind of karate is it, right?
no, it's combative sports at that point.
Yeah. You
It's
know,
not karate.
yeah. And again, I think it's important to maintain that original intent of what it was for. And it's funny
Mhm.
because I find that there's more guys in the West interested in doing that than people in Japan or Okinawa.
Yeah. Well, you know about the major organizations out here in Okinawa, right? About
Which,
how like you have the Shinkokai, it's tied in with the Department of Tourism.
yeah, right, right,
So they're more into pulling people over here to do tournaments and whatnot to increase tourism.
right,
So when the goal is to make money from tourism through karate, karate takes a second, seat to that.
right, right,
And I think that's what a lot of what's happening. It just becomes this, you know, purely sport. It loses the intent of self-defense, but it becomes the sport to generate tourism.
right. Well, it's interesting because even if you look at the meeting they had back in the 30s, right?
Yeah.
Well, all the big guns were there, and you read the minutes. The first time I read the minutes from those meetings, I was floored. I
Yeah.
was floored because I'm like, wait a second. These guys are talking about turning karate into a sport.
Hmm.
Wait a second. They're talking about creating standardized kata. What? Wait, what? What? Right?
Yeah.
And here are the pioneers, right? The guys, the big guns that we all talk about. So already they're already trying to figure out a way to make it more popular. And look, I get it. Everybody's worried that the art they practice or the things they do are going to die out, right?
Yeah.
So you want to figure out a way that to keep it going. I totally get that, and I can respect that. But it just goes to show you that even probably by that point, things were starting to get watered down. They weren't,
Yeah.
you know, there's probably a handful of guys that were still trying to teach it as a combat art. Um, you know, Mara McKenna's translation of Morinobu's book, right?
Hmm.
And you read that book, and he's complaining about it too. Like
Yeah.
but he was an Okinawan police officer, so at
Yeah.
least I'm sure he's at least at the minimum dealing with some drunken, rowdy individuals where he's having to use some techniques on them, right? So again, more of an interest in does it work,
Yeah.
not what it looks like, right? And yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I think Okinawa is going to have to try to figure it out. You know, and you know, I don't know what the future holds. Um, you know, but again, it's difficult. Like I discussed this with James Pankowitz and Dan Antonson.
Yeah.
Okinawa is an incredibly safe place. There's
Yep.
virtually no crime. So, do you need self-defense?
Yeah. It's one of those weird situations, right? Because it's like what I've always found is that people don't think they need it until they need it.
Well, like what I said to Dan and James, I said, well, I get that, but I said Okinawans don't travel. They don't go
Yeah.
to other countries. And I know when I go to certain countries, those countries are not necessarily safe, right? And I'm glad that I know how to defend myself, right? So, I mean, don't you want to your students to be able to defend themselves if, God forbid, they're attacked, right?
Yep.
I mean, look, you know, so it's not just about living on Okinawa. You know, we all know. I mean, the world's gotten a lot smaller. People travel all over the place. I mean, look, even when I went in '91 to Okinawa for the first time, I mean, there were not a lot of people traveling to Okinawa like there are
Right.
now. I mean, I was shocked at how many foreigners were there now. I mean, I think it's the most I've ever seen on the island. I mean, you're there. How many years you there now?
So mine's weird. I got here originally in '99,
Okay.
and then I've been on and off since then.
So you've
So it's
seen the
like,
change. You've seen the
yeah,
changes.
yeah.
I mean, I
Honestly,
remember. Go ahead.
like compared to how things are now, back when I think about how it was in '99, it's like not even recognizable.
Right.
It's like a whole different culture.
So in '91 when I was there, I stayed in Gushikawa, and
Hmm.
I lucked out. I made a reservation at a hotel that was walking distance of Master Shimbuku's dojo, and so I'd walk,
Yeah.
and people would stop me in the street to talk to me, Okinawans that spoke
Hmm.
English, and they always asked the same thing: "Are you a GI?" Right? And I'd say no, and they'd say, "Oh, why you come to Okinawa?" I'd say, "Oh, karate," and they'd go, "Oh, you know." And but I remember that trip. I think I saw one other foreigner.
Yeah.
One. I didn't, that was it, you know? And, I remember thinking, right? And, obviously in 97, when I was there for the grand opening of the Budokan, obviously there were a lot of foreigners there for that, but that was a
Yeah.
very big event. You know, but yeah, prior to that, I mean, I was there in 94 too. In 94, I bought a big group. So it was a little different, but still not a lot. And now, I mean, this last time, wow. I mean,
Yeah. Everywhere.
everywhere you walk you see foreigners, which I guess is good. I mean, my thing is and they're not, and the other thing is they're not all military anymore.
No, 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 no. They're from everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, they're just business people that are working there for
Yep.
various companies and whatnot. So it's amazing how it's changed,
Yeah.
you know.
It really is. Like I said, it's completely unrecognizable when I think back to how it was in '99 to now.
Right.
Yeah, two completely different beasts.
Yeah. So but I guess it's good. I mean, I know it's not a very wealthy prefecture. So look, I don't want to begrudge them using karate to bring tourism in, because if it helps put food on their table, I mean, I don't think we can ever knock people for that. I would just
Right.
like to see, like a more or less a two stream, right? Where you can
Yeah.
have that, and then but you still want to maintain the old way. And even if you're maintaining that older way with your more serious students, that's fine. You can have your public, similar to like we talked about when we had breakfast, where I asked you in your research, had you ever heard of any of the early pioneers of karate becoming indoor disciples of anybody in China?
Yeah.
Right.
And not really.
Right. Okay. And, so I mean, it wouldn't be a bad idea even to have something like that on Okinawa, where you have, the public karate that you're teaching, and then the people that are real serious, you're showing them more serious stuff, you know.
Right.
Um, and I think all the good teachers try to do that,
Mhm.
and and people say, well, like James, the reason James asked me to do the knife defense at his dojo that night, I don't know if you saw that video that was posted.
Yeah, yeah. It looked
Yeah.
pretty good actually.
Thanks. And that's only a small part of the curriculum. I mean, it's 2 hours. I couldn't do that much, but one of the things came up was we were talking about this subject, and I said, Tatsuo Shimabukuro had knife techniques that he taught,
Hmm.
and James and Dan looked at me, and I said, yeah, and they said it wasn't a lot. He would show a handful of techniques, very simple, basic, right? And so they said, oh, I wonder why he did that. I said, well, from my understanding is he worked in the Philippines for a while, and a guy tried to stab him in a bunkhouse, and he had to defend himself. Okay, there's
Yeah.
incentive, right? And then one of the things I said to them was, in that particular, in one of the Tatsuo techniques, a guy's got a knife in each hand.
Yeah.
Okay. And I remember seeing that when I was initially training, like, why would a guy have two knives? I'm thinking, why would a guy have two knives? And then at work one night, I had to approach a guy, and a guy reached into his coat pockets, and I trapped his hands in his pockets, never let him pull them out, and got him under control. And he had a knife in each pocket, and it was the exact same knife. It was two
Yeah, yeah.
replica knives, the same ones, and he was going to take them out and try to use them on me. And I remember thinking to myself, and probably saying it in class the next night, hey, listen to what happened. You know the technique that I always say, well, I don't know why Tatsuo does. Well, I had a guy last night going to try to bring two knives into play against me. So obviously it was a thing, right? And when I
Right.
brought that up, James says, you're right. I don't see anybody in Okinawa doing a lot of knife defense. Would you be willing to teach that? I said, yeah. And he said, well, I have a class tonight. And I said, sure. And, so it was the same thing. We had the same discussion, right? And, I just also find that kind of training interesting.
Yeah. Well, it kind of opens up the idea for what the scenario could potentially be because you never know. You never know what you're going to run into.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
you're preaching to the choir. I mean, we stopped guys that, just jumped the turnstile,
Yeah.
and you put your hand on the side of the guy to bring him over to ID him, and all of a sudden you feel the butt, and
Yeah.
he's got literally an assault rifle down his pants leg.
Yeah.
So, and again, when you walk out of the district that night to go on patrol, you're not thinking you're going to run into a guy who's got a rifle down his pants leg. But,
Yeah.
and the amount of knives we dealt with was, I mean, there was a time when virtually every single person we stopped had some type of edged weapon.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying they're trying to kill us with it, but they have an edged weapon. So when you're searching them, you're finding edged weapons all the time, all the time.
I think
Um,
that was a big cultural shift though back in the US because I remember like growing up as a kid, everybody had like a knife or a
right,
shotgun or
right,
something.
right.
And like I think maybe in the 90s is when that started kind of phasing out. But like I definitely remember that like growing up, everybody had something.
Yeah. And within the criminal element, their thought process always is the weapon is going to give me a huge advantage.
Right.
That
And
that that
everybody else is just like, maybe I'll, shoot a squirrel and skin it on the way
right,
home.
right. So again, when you're dealing with that mentality, it's very different because their idea is they want the advantage.
Right.
So they're hoping their weapon they have a weapon, you don't have a weapon, And so yeah. So I mean, so I taught that night, and it was funny. James reached out for me the next day, and he sent me a message, and he goes, "Boy, that was eye opening for a lot
Mhm.
of my students. Like they had never even thought about any of that stuff." Because I talked about a bunch of different things, what happens to your body in those kinds of situations, the
Yeah.
chemicals that are going on, the
That
way the
fight or
body
flight.
reacts. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that goes on, and again, people don't realize it unless they've experienced it a lot,
Yeah.
and again, like I told them, I said, the big thing is um, surviving the first encounter. So if
Yeah.
you survive it, you can build on it. And then if you're like a guy like me who was constantly engaged in a lot of hand-to-hand combat, um, it becomes like anything else. You get used to it. So you calm
Yeah.
down more. You don't let your emotions get the better of you. You don't let your heart rate go up because it becomes, I hate to use the term, but it does. It becomes almost normalized. Well, it's the same thing in combat, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you see guys that are involved in a lot of firefights. I mean, they're walking around sometimes, there's bullets going off, and they're as calm as cucumbers because they know for whatever the angle is and stuff, they can't be hit. Meanwhile, the guy, it's his first time. He's looking at the guy going, that guy's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I remember the first shooting I responded to, a guy was shooting at cops out of a second story window. And I got there, I was a rookie. I had about 3 weeks on, and I was hiding behind a wall. And this old timer was just walking around. And other cops are yelling at him, get down, get down. He goes, that guy can't hit me from there. Like, like he knew that distance, there was no way the guy was going to be able to hit him because it was a handgun he was using. He wasn't using a
Yeah.
rifle, right? But us new guys, we were all like, hiding behind walls and stuff. So it's the same thing with self-defense. You get used to it. But I would just like to see where there is an effort on Okinawa to get back to more of a realistic type of training where the attacks are more realistic instead of this, let's start in this position and come in with a karate style punch, which I hate to break the news to everyone. No one ever punched at me like that in the street.
Yeah. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. So, and I think it would just open up more possibilities. And I also think it makes the training more interesting,
Mhm.
you know?
I think though, other than the older guys who are still here right now, I think all this younger generation are only going towards sport
Right.
because I'm starting to see less and less of actual self-defense and
Right.
more about, like doing sport kumite and stuff like
Right.
that. And
Yeah.
what's funny is they never teach the big secret, which is if you just go up and you slap the guy, you can send their adrenaline through the roof because they're not used to actually being hit.
Right.
And then they're overthrowing their shots.
Right. Right.
And it's just so funny. It's just like, why don't you teach this? Why don't you teach them about adrenaline? And,
Right. Right.
and they're like, well, no one ever mentioned that.
And the thing is, it's not just adrenaline. There's all kinds of
Yeah.
stuff that's going on with the body.
Yep.
Cortisol. There's a lot of different things that are going on. I mean, in combat, your body believes it's engaging in combat, life and death combat. I mean,
Right.
your blood vessels constrict. I
My
mean,
cat keeps bugging me over here.
yeah. So it's, it's interesting the stuff that goes on. And again, because none of this stuff is really talked about anymore within martial arts because no one's doing it. I mean, I guarantee you, if all of a sudden there was a crime wave on Okinawa and people were being assaulted, I guarantee you'd see a big change in karate.
Yep, it changed a lot. And
Yeah.
so it's interesting because there is older Tuide stuff that you see from time to time. And
Right.
I have a whole thing about that in the book
Right.
where it's the black and white photos, like
Right.
the scenarios. So my approach on that has not been to teach technique one, technique two, technique three, but it's to teach how to actually do like the hold and try to hold the person there as much as possible. And then I teach the other people like this is the principle of the hold. Like if I grab a wrist, right? It's
Right.
like where's the weakness? Well, it's between the fingers.
Right.
So you teach them that, and then you just say, okay, play with it.
Right.
And then after a few minutes, you have them rotate. So then now they have a new partner doing the same thing.
Right.
And I found that teaching people that way tends to make the self-defense side of it a lot more permanent in their head because they're not thinking, okay, technique one, technique two, technique three. Oh crap, I'm out of techniques. Now what am I
Right.
gonna do?
Right.
So that needs to come back, I think.
Well, we do a drill in the dojo where we have a person stand in the middle and we have the 8 points of attack, a person
Mhm.
at each of the 8 points. And then usually it's me. I'm on the outside. I stand behind the person that's in and I nod to someone to attack. And they
Yeah,
have to attack on that angle. So if they're on the side, they can't come around to the front. They've got to attack on the angle. And they can do any attack they want as long as it's not something out of a movie, meaning it's got to be
yeah,
something that's common sense that we see all the time. And then the person has to develop that reaction. Like, can
mhm,
they react to it? Can they do it? And a lot of our self-defense training here is the same thing. We'll do it where two people pair off and I say, okay, work on self-defense. And then one person just reach out and grab the person and they've got to get out. Or one person will reach out and go to do something to them and they've got to deal with it. So it's not a lot of we don't do a lot of prearranged stuff. Obviously,
right,
with a Kobudo, it's different. You're dealing with weapons. You've got to be a lot more careful. You make a mistake with a weapon, you know, you can have
yeah,
a pretty bad result. Okay. So I understand that's got to be a little bit more controlled. With the empty hand stuff, we had a tendency to be a little bit more freer, right?
yeah,
And obviously my law enforcement students who have used the stuff a lot. But my civilian students, maybe a handful of them over the years have been attacked for real, but serious situations, and they've all come out on top. And it was interesting; they all had the same response. So it was just like in the dojo. The guy
yeah,
took a swing at me, and it's just the way someone does it here, right? Again, going back to everything
yeah,
coming from this position, it's just not real, right? And I think if we went back and we could talk to people like Motobu and these different guys, I don't think they'd be expecting you to engage a guy from some type of Kamai position.
right.
It'd be natural. You'd be in a natural position and just, so
Well, Kamai is an interesting concept in general. So what I found is for me, a Kamai works good as a starting point. So in other words, I could say, okay, Nikwa Shidachi Shudan Shutouki, right? Or I could just say Seishin no Kamai.
right,
And they know the whole posture is that.
right,
So I
right,
don't have to break it down that way.
right,
So I can say, okay, starting from here, this is the scenario.
right,
So they work really good as a starting position.
right,
Now, with the Kojuryu stuff that I was doing, there's an interesting thing that they do with the Kamai training, where essentially you have these 12 core Kamai,
okay.
and the idea is the person's going to throw different attacks, but you're going to either defend or counterattack using the Kamai.
Meaning like it's an on guard position. Like I think every movement in a kata is a technique to be used
Mhm.
on an opponent. There's no rest points. There's no like in Kusanku, in Ishinru, we hear this thing that Kusanku is a night fighting kata. Uh, I'm not buying it.
Yeah,
I'm just not, right? I'm not buying what they're selling. Okay. You know, uh, I think any kata, any techniques can be used to fight at night. I don't think you develop a specific kata for fighting at night. Um,
yeah,
but again, like in Kusanku, they say, "Oh, you're feeling for the enemy in the dark as you're stepping and pivoting, going to kamais," and I'm like, "No way, right? It's just not. It just doesn't make any sense, right?" on any level. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think they're all techniques, fighting techniques. Because again, you look at the Chen form, which has about, when you talk individual movements, it's probably a little over 300 individual movements in the form. I mean, it's a really
Mhm.
long form. And I've never heard them use the term, well, this is your position to face the enemy in. Like,
Yeah.
there's none of that. Every move is breaking an arm, striking the guy, throwing the guy. There's no, well, you're going to face him, you're going to stand like this. There's none of that, right?
So
Everything's from a natural position.
I think a lot of the Kamai stuff came in from the sword training that the guys were doing. Because when you start thinking about it, right, you have like Haso no Kamai, Jodo no
Right,
Kamai.
right,
So I think it was more that. So when you have guys like Matsumura Soken who are training with like the Jigendu,
right,
because he used a lot of sword terminology in his karate.
right,
And I think that's where a lot of that came from. Because it's like, oh, this is like Haso no Kamai, or
right, right,
whatever.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's possible. I mean, it's definitely possible. I mean, obviously in Kotori Shinto, we have Kamai. I mean,
Yep.
again, when you have a weapon, you're facing him. I mean, it's interesting because with weapons, you're 100% going to have Kamai. I mean, if I'm doing a building clearance, right, and I have my gun out in front of me, right, it's a Kamai. I'm in a specific position as I'm moving around, right? Uh,
Yep.
you can't be free, right? If I'm doing the same thing with a rifle, it's the same thing. So we see it in weapons, but I think and again, for empty hand, I think it's different because the other token is, you get in one of these kamais, you basically just hung a sign on yourself that says, I know martial arts.
Right.
And I don't want the enemy to know I know anything. Like my standard joke in the dojo is I want him to know I know something when he wakes up in the ambulance or when he wakes up in front of the pearly gates. I don't want
Mhm.
him to know anything about me. So, and even Musashi in the Goryu no Sho, he says, natural.
Yeah.
Your movements have to become positions have to be. Funakoshi says it in the 20 precepts, right?
Yep.
And I think that's one of the problems I see in modern karate is the movements aren't natural enough. They're
Right.
just they should be more flow. There should be more faster footwork. I filmed some stuff today where I was talking about that. Um, you know, but yeah, I mean, so talk a little bit about Kojuryu.
Oh, yeah. Gojuryu is kind of like a big misconception, I think. So what's interesting is I know a lot of people who know Kojo Kafu Sensei,
Okay,
and none of them knew that he was teaching anything other than Shibana Sensei's karate.
okay,
So it's interesting because it's like all these guys, you're like, oh, what about Kojo Sensei? And they're like, oh yeah, he was a Shibana guy.
right,
So what it turns out was that Kojo Sensei worked at the same precinct that Shibana Sensei was at, and
okay,
he learned his Shorinryu. And it was like the family stuff they had didn't really have any basics or anything. So
okay,
largely what he taught was actually Chibana Sensei's Shorinryu. So
okay,
everybody thought he was a Shorinryu guy who had a few extra kata.
right,
That was kind of what the view was. Um, but it's really interesting because now you have these different groups that are trying to say, oh yeah, we trained with him and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, but I mean, really what he taught was more Shorinryu. And then he
okay,
had his family stuff on the side. But the family stuff, it's weird because it was like it wasn't like stylized back in like, the 1600s or anything.
right, right,
It was like you had this one guy, his name was Kojo Choko. He went over to Beijing to actually study calendar making.
okay,
And that was why he went. So did you see the note that I have in the book about how you have Takahara Zenshu who had like he literally got all the records of everybody who went to China as
right,
part of the exchange program. Yeah.
right,
There's only like 94 people in the entire history of it.
right,
So 500 years, 94 people. He's actually on the list and it says he went there to study calendar making. He came back and I guess he had seen some of the cavalry and stuff like that do things and they revered him as this, crazy war guy. But it's like, no, he went to actually study calendar making. So you kind of, okay, maybe he learned something on the side. Cool. He taught it to his family and it just kind of brewed in there. And it was like the katas and stuff didn't even get created until like, 1860s, 1870s.
right,
Um, the six kata come from Issei Kojo and Kaho Kojo. And it was like towards the end. There was Jojitsu in there.
Okay.
That came from the early 1800s. But other than that, it was just like, self-defense is like two-person type stuff.
Right.
But it didn't actually even get called Kojoryu until Kojo Kafu opened the dojo in like the 1950s.
Okay.
So this whole thing about it being this ancient thing is like a half-truth
Okay.
because it was like it developed over time.
Right.
And then what was kind of going on was that Kojo Kafu wanted to retire and he was going to pass the dojo to his son, Kojo Shiguryu. And then Shiguryu sensei, he died like really young.
Okay.
And when that happened, that was in like 75. And he just kind of gave up on it and just closed the dojo at that point.
Right.
So it was only really taught on Okinawa for about 25 years. And the majority of the people who went there actually got Shorinryu.
Okay.
It's like only the really senior guys got, the Kojoryu stuff.
Yeah, I think I saw a video of Angel Lemus, I think it was. The late Angel
Yeah.
Lemus doing some of the Kojuru kata.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean they're interesting kata.
Yeah. Well, there's other problems with it too, because it was like nobody's really got corrections or anything for like the last 40 years on that, or 50
Right.
years now.
Right.
So you're looking at this material that's based on how people remember it.
Right.
So you look at guys like Iramaji Sensei, who teaches it. His stuff looks different than Hayashi Sensei, who's up in mainland.
Right.
Um, you have all these guys, and they're all doing something different. And so, like the Kojo material that we brought into Ryuhoryu, it was literally like a comparative analysis where you would like break down the kata movement by movement from different people.
Okay.
And it was really interesting because I think that all in all, they're probably about 95% the same,
Right.
but the big changes was on the sides.
Right.
So like one would start on the right, the other would start on the left, but it's the same Kamai. It's
Right.
the same base
Right.
movement. And then it's like they turn and be the same, and then they would step again, and then they're on the opposite feet again.
Right.
So it's like what we did is we went through and we standardized it. So like a 2 out of 3. So of the people that we saw doing it, if 2 of them did it one way and the third one did it another way, we just said that the 2 is probably correct. And we recreated all 6 of those kata for Ryuhoryu to preserve them,
Right.
doing that method. Because the problem is, like, even if you go talk to the guys like Kojo Tatsumi to go get corrections, they're like, yeah, I don't really remember how it went.
Well, it's interesting because this has been going on for forever.
Yes, exactly.
Because you look at all the different people that studied with Keon, right?
Right.
And you look at everybody's versions of Kusanku, right? It's different, right?
Yeah.
There's and again, like for instance with Ishinryu. So when I look at the Ishinryu Seisan and I look at Joe and Nakazato's Seisan, it's almost exact.
Right.
It's almost exact. So I say, okay, well, that's probably a pretty good idea of how Keon was doing Seisan. But then I see other students that supposedly study with Keon, and I see the Seisan looks kind of different. There's been dramatic changes in how they're moving their bodies and different things. And I say, okay, well, someone made a change along the way. And again, I don't care if you make a change. I mean, you can do it. People can do whatever they want, right? But it's the same thing. I think this has been an issue for forever. Meaning, you've got, you have all these people that train with the same guy, and then they're all doing the form slightly different.
Yeah.
Right? And again, I don't know that that's necessarily a big deal or a terrible thing. I don't. As long as the principles are there, they're moving right, they're using their bodies correctly. I think that's the main thing. But yeah, it seems to always be a problem because, like I walked in my dojo one night and I happened to see a class was going on. I walk in and one of my black belts does a move from Kusanku. And I'm like, I said, do that move again. He does it again. I said, where'd you get that? He says, oh, Sensei so-and-so. Because, I've got guys in my dojo that are very senior. Sensei so-and-so showed me, went over that with us the other night. I said, what? He's doing it like, that's how he's doing it? And they go, yeah. I said, no, that's not how you do it. You do it like this. And I showed him. And then, so Sensei so-and-so comes in the next class. I said, hey, let me see kata so and so. He does it. I said, all right, why are you doing that move like that? He goes, oh, that's how you showed me.
Yeah.
And I said, just so we're clear, I'm doing this 40 years. I've never ever done that move like that once in 40 years.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, maybe out of the corner of his eye or a certain angle, he saw me move and thought I did a move a certain way. And he thought that was the way to do it, right? So you
Hmm.
can see where these things can happen where, and then the other thing is like again, I can only speak of Ishinryu because that's what I train in. We know for a fact that Tatsuo was teaching kata differently at different times. Like he had moves he showed differently. And then later on, he changed them to other ways. Like perfect example is Tokumini no Kun. He used to do the opening the way Kion had showed him. And then
Yeah.
once he trained with Taira, he standardized all the openings of the bow kata to make them look more like the Taira way of opening them. So yeah, it's just fascinating. And even when I went in '97, we were going to do the demonstration of Sun Sukata with Kichiro students, and I watched them do it, and there was a few slight differences in how they did the form. So I
Hmm.
said to Master Shimbuka, I said, Sensei, you got to watch me do this kata. There's a few things different. So I did it, and he goes, oh, no, no, it's fine. And I'm like, no, it's not. Like, there's a few differences. But again, he wasn't hung up on slight differences. He was hung up on how's the speed and power, how's the balance, the techniques are right. It's just, so Mike's got his hand a little bit different this way, where my guys have got their hand. They don't get hung up on that, which seems to be a constant in Okinawa. The
Yeah.
the term you hear all the time is two-way okay,
Mm.
right? And a lot of Westerners get hung up on that because they want it one way. No, no, I
Yeah.
want it that one way, the right way, right? Well, maybe there's two or three right ways. I mean that's the thing. We don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think the best way to do it is to figure out how you want to standardize it for your own school
Right.
and then just take ownership of it and be like, this is our version of it.
Right. Right.
Because
And
that's
again,
what I did.
yeah, and again, like I'm sure there's people that'll probably say, well, who is this guy, Scot Mertz, to do this, whatever. But everybody else did it. I mean,
Exactly.
and anybody that started doing their own thing did it. And one of the things I say all the time, people say to me, I get asked every once in a while, Mike, why don't you start your own style? And I look at him and I go, well, I'm already teaching my own style. And they go, well, no,
Hmm.
no, you teach Ishinryu, you teach Matayoshi. I go, right, I'm teaching my version of Ishinryu. And, some people like my version of Ishinryu and some people don't. And I don't really care. It's the
Yeah.
version that works for me. Same with Matayoshi, same with any of the arts I do. I mean, I think at a certain point, you're doing your version of it. You emulate the teacher, you try to do it like the teacher does, but at some point, you have to figure out that method that works for you. And I think everybody that started doing their own thing, right? Um, went through that process. I mean, look at Tatsuo Shimobuku, right?
Hmm.
I
Well,
mean,
everything has to start somewhere.
right, right.
So,
And if what you're doing is quality, you'll have people that want to learn from you. I mean, that's one of the things I say all the time. Having had a commercial school in New York City, you know, um, you get students one of two ways. You have a good line of bullshit where
mhm,
you get them to sign on that dotted line because you coax them into it, or you have a good product. And if you have a good product, you'll always have students. And if you have a good line of bullshit, you'll always have students, but you won't have students that last
right.
because the product's not there. And I think if you work at the product and the product's good, I think you'll have people that want to train with you.
Mhm.
It's as simple as that. And like I said, the book I think is much more than your style. And I don't
Yes.
mean I don't mean that as a knock. I mean that as a big plus. Um, you know, um, the stuff that's in it is just, I mean, it's such a wide swath. You cover so much information in here. I mean, there's something for everybody. I mean, literally.
Yes.
I mean, the book's 300 pages. I mean, uh, it's tremendous the stuff that's in here. I mean, you covering, Koteki Tai, you've got Machimi exercise, and you got, and then you've got photo breakdown of a bunch of the different kata you do. So it's great. I mean, but again, for me personally, that first section of the book, that history section, was absolutely phenomenal. phenomenal. And then, I think you had the section at the end too on the Ruru Ko thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So it was funny on that because China actually put out a letter saying, this guy you guys are saying is Ruruko is not him. And I actually got the letter and I put it in there and then I put a translation of it.
which for me was great because I'd heard about that controversy, but I never saw the actual letter. So for me, when I got to that, I was like, oh, and I sat there and I read it and I read it again. And reading that other Bubishi, the one that the guy from Taiwan did and
Mhm.
translated, it's interesting hearing what he believes and what his research has showed how these Okinawan masters learned Chinese kung fu. We'll use
Yeah.
that as a catch-all, right? And how basically they were at that Ryukyu house that
Yep.
was
The
outside
Ryukyu
of
Farm.
right. And
Actually,
these,
I even have pictures of that in the book too.
yeah,
There's a whole section
yeah,
where, so I actually went over there in, was it 2017?
right,
And I took pictures of all of it.
right,
And it's actually a pretty cool building when you see it. They
right.
turned it into a museum.
And the thing is it makes sense what he's saying, right? So,
Yep.
they're going there and they see some guys do martial arts. And if they're young guys, they're going to look and go, wow, that looks pretty cool. Right.
Mhm.
Um, and then say, hey, could I learn that? Well, whatever. And, maybe they start showing, but then they start, if they offered them money and paid for lessons, look, everybody wants money. Everybody needs money, right? It's as simple as that. So I'm sure some of them did get some quality instruction. But then the other thing he points out in that book is, which I found very interesting, is they had rotating instructors where
Yep.
they'd invite a guy in for like 4 months.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're getting his version of stuff. And again, it sounds to me like most of it is two-man stuff. They're learning
Yeah.
techniques, which again, if you look at the drawings in the Bubishi, right, it's all two-man stuff. You have some of the ones but it's almost all two-man stuff, right?
Right.
And okay, so you got the guy from this branch of Crane or Shin Yi or whatever, and now for the next 4 months, you've got a guy doing Mantis. So if you've got a guy
Yeah.
doing this, and so I think depending on how long you were there, you could have been exposed to a bunch of very different and interesting martial
Yeah.
arts and martial arts concepts, you know, and even him in that book talks about the fact that the Crane seems to have grabbed a hold of even everyone in China.
Yeah.
And everybody wanted an attachment to Crane. And I think, arts like Shinyi, Taiji, and Bagua had already gone internal, and then you see the Crane, which comes from external becoming internal, right?
Right.
And and then there's also a mention there that they believe there is a possible link to Chen style.
Mhm.
And McCarthy Sensei has said that too. So for me, a guy who's done Chen style and is part of the lineage, to me it's fascinating, right?
Yeah.
That all these things could possibly be linked, right? And this week's podcast, which drops tomorrow, is I demonstrate moves from certain karate kata, and then I demonstrate those moves how we do them in the Chen form,
Mm.
how we do them in Shinyi, and how they do them in Shi He Quan. And I just pick a bunch of them random, right? And again, I'm doing the Ishin Kata, right? So
Right.
I'm sure if I did the Chen form for you, and you'd go, oh my God, that looks exactly like this move we do in this kata, right? And that's the thing I find fascinating, and that's why like I title this podcast that's coming out tomorrow, the Chinese connection, right?
Mhm.
Because again, the longer I'm seeing Okinawan karate, I'm seeing it going more of a Japanese karate direction.
Right.
And my karate has done the opposite. It's gone in the direction of China, right?
Yeah.
And even when Master Chen Zhanghua was here in July, I decided to pick a few moves from kata. And I said, let me show you a couple of moves, right? And I did it, and I did a move from Chen, and he just looked at me. And then I did another one, and he just looked at me, right? And I did another one, and he looked at me. And I said, listen, there's a connection here. I said, the problem is karate's lost its way a little bit because it's all become about sport.
Yeah.
I said, but I'm not about that. So, I even had Walt Van Gilson came to one of my seminars, which again, that shocked me. I mean, he's a first generation student, studied with Tatsuo, lived on Okinawa, why are you coming to my seminar? I'm just Mike Calandra. You're, and he says that, well, he says, I see the stuff you're doing and I find it interesting. So, at the end, and I was talking about a lot of the Chinese concepts that I felt were missing from karate now. And at the end, he said to me, he says, you're doing what we should have done. We should have looked to China, but we didn't.
Mhm.
He goes, we only looked to Okinawa. He says, but we should have probably gone further back and looked to China. And, for me, I'm lucky, right? Because Chen Zhanghua walked into my school in New York.
Yeah.
So it's the 100% parable of when the student's ready, the teacher will appear. So I'd had about 20 years in karate, and my karate was going in a direction which had started from a Gojuryu sensei, who was a
Right.
big student of the Bubishi, Bob Tayani. And he had started me in a direction. And then someone said, hey, did Taiji, was renting my space to teach Taiji. He says, oh, I'd like to bring my Taiji master, and he's really good at fighting, but I don't have any students. Will you bring your karate guys? And I said, sure. And he walked in, and when I saw how he was moving and how he generated speed and power, and I was like, okay, wait a second. This isn't the Taiji I've seen. This doesn't
Right.
look anything like the park Taiji. And then he started to explain and show it to us. He was in a room full of karate goons, right? So he knew he had to bring it, right? And he did. And we were all like, holy crap, our whole opinion of Taiji had changed. And and then when he started explaining principles and stuff, and I started realizing, well, this is what we're missing in karate. Like, we're not principle based anymore as much as we should, you know.
Hmm.
And then too, Lu Chang Yi from Feeding Crane,
Yep.
that helped a lot also. But really, it's the Chen style. The Chen style, I'd say, and Chen Zhanghua's teachings have really helped me. And he even says to me, he says, you should help bring the Chinese, the Chen style and the principles back into karate. Like, he's advocating for that.
Right.
Like, he's not against that. Like, he's like, yeah, Mike, do it, like, do it. So so I just find it fascinating. And your book, and again, that other book that I just read, obviously McCarthy's Bubishi, really shows now, it's really showing the link is clear to China. But don't get me wrong. I also think there's a Satsuma link to Okinawan karate, the
Hmm.
Japanese martial arts, like you mentioned, Jigenryu. I do Sosui Shitsu. That's a Satsuma martial art. Okay. They were members of the Satsuma clan. Um, so again, I just think when you put people together, even if initially those people are conquerors, in case of the
Hmm.
Satsuma, I think as you start to get along and cooperate with each other, I think there's probably going to be an exchange of stuff. You're going to get friendly with a guy, he's going to show you some jujitsu. You're going to get friendly
Hmm.
with another guy, he's going to show you some Jigenryu, right? And we know there's a Jigenryu lineage on Okinawa, right? So
Hmm.
I think Okinawan karate is a kind of conglomerate of several different things, but I think the original thing, I think mostly is probably Chinese, and then things were added after that. You know,
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
what's your feeling on that?
I think that a lot of it's actually kind of more indigenous, but I think it was heavily Chinese influenced. Because if you look at like I can see, because I have also trained in like Bai Mei and Bai He, um, I can see movements that are identical,
Right,
but I don't see entire sequences that are identical.
right,
So what I think happened is these guys are going train, but they might not have necessarily got a kata.
right,
So let's say they got some two-person drills or something, right? When they went back, because they didn't really have any kata to remember it, they started creating these kata.
right.
But it was
Yeah,
based on technique that they had
yeah, I
learned.
100% agree with that.
Yeah.
I think there's very few Okinawan kata that you can find in China.
Yeah. Other than
Not,
like Sanchin,
yeah,
it's like you're done.
right. Nepai, but how many
Yeah.
people are really doing Nepai,
Well,
right?
I do Shiba, which is the actual Chinese version of it.
Right. And so, I do the net pie that McCarthy sensei taught me, right? So,
Yeah.
so again, though, but even when I see other versions of net pie, whether it be the Chinese version or like the Tunru version, right? You're
Yep.
still seeing there's a common root there.
Yes.
Like, so again, it's that thing of where this guy either forgot a little bit or changed it a little bit. This guy did the same, but you see, they all come from a common root. It's like Sanchin.
Yes.
It's clear that all the Sanchin kata come from a common root. Even in Okinawa, when you look at Seisan kata, right?
Yeah.
Okay, duh, right? Every system has Seisan. They all have similarities to it, right?
You know what's interesting on the Seisan one? Itotsu lineage doesn't have it.
The Itosu lineage doesn't have it.
That's the only lineage that doesn't have Seisan. So
Interesting.
if you look at like the Chibana Shorinryu, which is
Right,
actually from Itotsu,
right.
no Seisan.
Hmm.
So a lot of the
Interesting.
guys who had Seisan, they got it from Matsumura Kosaku and his guys, like
Right,
Iha Katatsu and
right.
those guys. They're the ones who are piping it into the Shorinryu groups, which it just blows my mind because it's like specifically the Totsu lineage doesn't have it, and that's the only one. It's
Well, it's
just like
interesting because like uh Matsubashiru doesn't do it.
right,
So that was another thing that okay, well Kion, but and you know from everything you hear, Seisan was the kata for Kion, meaning like
right.
you better have good Seisan or you aren't learning anything else, right? But they don't have it in their lineage, which I always found kind of baffling, to be quite honest.
Well, it makes you wonder, like, what was the duration of instruction with him? Because it could have been that, he was only there for a little bit and
Right.
didn't learn it.
Right. Well, the other thing is, I mean, we know this too from the Chen style. So we like one my Chen Jianghua. So our lineage is Chen Fake to Hong Jiang Shen to Chen Jianghua. Um, and as my teacher says, you want to know who the disciples were? Who attended the funeral?
Yeah, it's
And
very true.
right. So I'm not going to get into it, right? But a lot of the people claiming the lineage and claiming they were disciples of maybe had a cup of coffee with them.
Yeah,
Okay. I think we probably have the same type of thing in karate a little bit. And again, it's not a knock. Like me, I prefer the guy that says to me, "Hey, listen, like I'll use myself as an example. I've trained and met a lot of the first generation students in Ishinru that
mhm,
trained with Tatsuo. Some I trained with a lot, some I basically had a cup of coffee with.
yeah,
Now, it was great experience meeting all of them and talking to them, but I can't say, well, this guy taught me a lot because I didn't spend a lot of time with him, you know.
right.
Where a guy like Walter Van Gilson, I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but the time I spent with him was extremely productive, which that's something
Mhm.
else you can have happen, right? Maybe you don't spend a lot of time with a particular individual, but for whatever reason, you click and you get something magical from that guy
Yeah,
that changes your martial art. So yeah, I think there's a lot of to be said about that. I think, and that how long did a person study with him?
yeah,
Like I asked, it's like anything, getting answers on how long Tatsuo Shimabuku trained with Chojun Miyagi. You know, it's just not clear.
yeah,
I mean, we want it to be clear, but I don't think it's ever going to be clear. I mean, we just don't know. Where we know he trained with Keon. I mean,
right.
Tokamura was funny when I asked him. I asked him in 1998, and he goes, Keon. It's funny how he answered. He goes, "Oh, Keon Sensei lives right over there, right?" And he goes,
Yeah,
Miyagi Sensei, he was further away. He wasn't as close, so it's hard to get. Although we know that at one point he was up in Tatsuo's area.
yeah.
And then
He
there's
was in
this,
Taba after the
yeah,
war.
yeah.
Yeah,
So, but again, so you got the Kaikon saying that Tatsuo trained with him pre-war.
yeah, which I don't think that's accurate.
Well, Kichido Sensei says it's not accurate.
Right.
I asked Kichido Sensei when I was just there. I said, the Kaikon says your father trained with Miyagi Sensei first. He goes, and this is, I'm going to imitate him now. He goes, oh, I don't think so.
Yeah,
That's literally what he said. He says, I believe he trained with Kion Sensei first. You know,
yeah.
um, you know, like when it comes to Seiyuchin, our Seiyuchin is different, right? So is it a question of that's the version he learned from Miyagi? Is that the best Tatsuo could remember it?
Oh,
I mean, I don't personally get hung up on it, meaning like it is what it is. Um,
I don't think he learned it from Miyagi at all.
that's a possibility too.
So Motobu, he had learned Sanchin from a guy named Kuniyoshi Shinkatichi.
Okay.
I think that they're doing the Motobu one because it's very, very similar. Like with the ankles and stuff, it's nearly identical.
So I've never seen the Motobu version of that.
Yeah. So there's a book that came out several years ago that actually has all the Motobu kata in it,
Okay.
and Sanchin's one of them. And
Okay.
it's nearly a dead ringer for the Ishinru version.
So what else is funny is this idea that certain teachers were only practicing certain kata.
No,
I
no, there
find
was
this, I find that to me is one of the funniest thing there is because I've heard stories where Keon also did Sanchin.
yep,
Yeah. I'm just saying these guys, which I give those guys credit, they were, they were at least exchanging information.
yes,
It,
a lot.
it's the pre Coke versus Pepsi era of karate,
Yeah.
where these guys were trying to figure it out. Okay, hey, let me show you what I learned. Oh yeah, let me show you this. Maybe you'll like this. And and I think that was great.
Mhm.
I think that probably helped a lot of things. Yeah. So again, that was worth having you on the podcast just to hear the fact that Motobu Sensei did a version of Seiyuchin, and it's
Yeah.
possible that that's the version we're doing in Ishinru. So now I'm going to have to find a copy of that book.
I can send you a link. It's on the Japanese Amazon.
Yeah, can you send that to me? I'd like to get
Yeah.
that book and check it out.
When you see it, you're just gonna be like, oh my God,
Well,
that's
it's
like
the
move
same.
for
It's the
move.
same thing. For years, I would hear, again, yeah, there's a bias against Ishinru on Okinawa. I get it, especially amongst certain groups, because Tatsuo was making a lot of money from the United States government, and no one's
Yeah.
going to tell me that that's not why there's a bias, right? Also Tatsuo, a bit of a maverick, did his own thing, went his own way. Okay, but they all did, right? I
Yeah.
mean, they all did. That's what's funny, right? But it's the same thing with Ishinru going to the left in the Hanshi. We start going to the
Well,
left.
ours
But
goes to the left too.
right, but Tamarate and Motobu, they both go to the left. Motobu, I think, goes both directions. They practice
Yeah.
it both ways, I think, right?
Yep.
So again, but from certain Shorinryu people in the States, I'd hear things like, yeah, well, you Ishinryu guys are weird. Like you go to the left in the Hanshi.
I know. So you know who actually started that with going to the right?
No.
It was the version that Itotsu was teaching for the schools.
Okay.
So
Okay.
all these guys were getting it from the school system, whereas going to the right. But all the
Okay.
guys who trained prior to 1905, who was actually like in Tamari and in Naha, they're
Right.
all getting the ones that went to the left.
Okay.
So it was a change that he made for the school system.
I wonder why he made that change.
There's a lot of things that he did that I would really love to know why.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things like I tell people, and I'll do an Ishinru seminar, and people will ask me a question and I just look at them and go, you know, I'd love to have a seance with Tatsuo Sensei and
Yeah.
ask him these questions, but it's not happening. And I remember Gakia Sensei one time. I asked him about a specific movement in Shushinokun Bokata. I said, Sensei, why do we do it like this? He looked at me and he goes, Michael, I did not make the kata.
Yeah.
Like, Michael, this is the way Mariyoshi showed me, and probably the way his father showed him. And we didn't make the kata. This is the way we were shown. So this is the way we do it. And yeah, that's fascinating. So I never heard that about that Motobu actually practiced a version. Was it Choki or was it the Motobu family?
It was Choki's book that
Okay.
it's in, but
Okay.
it was like it's his lineage from like modern day.
Right.
But it was like supposedly these are all the kata that he taught. There's like
Right.
it's like 40 kata in there. It's like a
Right.
lot.
Right.
Like I
Wow.
said, I'll send you the link to the book, man, because it was kind of mind blowing when I'm looking at it, going, hey, wait a minute, this all looks familiar.
Well, it's funny. I trained with Tayani Sensei who studied with Sasui Ishikawa.
Yeah,
And again in the mainland, and he also he lived with Yamaguchi Sensei for like a year.
yeah,
Um, and his karate went from sport fighting to the complete opposite, right? And big student of Bubishi, trying to learn the principles and whatnot. And so I would go to him on a Sunday, like once a month, and he wasn't interested in teaching me the Gojuryu kata. So I'd go in,
mhm,
he'd go, okay, do your version of Seiyuchin. And I remember the first time I did it, he goes, I gotta say, I like your angles better. Like I don't like that 45-degree angle we do at the opening of Seiyuchin in Gojuryu. He says, I think it makes more sense the way you guys do it. And I would just go, okay. Because again, that's the only way I know how to do it, right? But I
right,
know for a fact, Walter Van Gilson told me he saw Okinawans in the Okinawan only class also practicing it on the angles like they do in
yeah,
Boku. So again, I think Tatsuo was probably teaching more than one version of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting because like in our version, after we do the punch and we go to the elbow, Gojuryu steps back and does the rising elbow,
Yes.
and we step in and do it. We don't do that step back. So it's just some interesting, very interesting
Yeah.
subtle differences within the form. But I never had heard that Motobu
Yeah.
also practiced a version of Seiuchin. Right.
So the Sakiyama version of it actually starts off in Sanchin dodge. So
Mm.
those first three movements are actually in
In
Sanchin
Sanchin.
dodge.
Hmm. Interesting.
It's like there's so many different variations depending on which lineages you want to look at.
And I did ask Motobu Naoki.
Yeah.
I asked him. I said, is there, and he about Tatsuo training with his grandfather, and he said, I've seen numerous documents that show Tatsuo trained with my grandfather.
Yeah.
I've seen it in numerous places where I've researched, and I think Motobu being as well known as he was, I think you probably had a lot of people seeking him out, you know.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
one of
there's
the
also the Kinkyukai sessions too in the 30s.
right,
And all those guys are going together and training.
right,
So, it's just
right.
how it was kind of happening.
Right. And yeah, it's just fascinating to me how now it's funny, right? Now you know, if you're doing one style and you go to another style, oh, you shouldn't do that. Oh, no, it's not good. No, just, stay with us. Um, it's funny when I went to see Kichiro Sensei in 1991, he told me to go out and make my own strong Ishinryu. He said, go train with anybody you think is better than you and make your own strong Ishinryu. And when I met
Mhm.
Tayani Sensei and he started introducing me to these concepts, I'm like, huh, hmm, this is different, right?
Yeah.
And and that started me on a certain path. And then when I met Chen Zhanghua and then later on Lu Changyi and all these different influences, like a couple of people in Okinawa asked me, they said to me, like Josh asked me, he goes, why do you move so different than all the other Ishinru guys? And he said, is it the Chinese influence? I said, well, I think it's all the influence, right?
Yeah.
And I said, and the other thing too is don't discount the combat experience.
Yeah.
That
Because that
changes
that
how you
plays a
move.
yeah, that's a big part of it.
It changes how you move 100%. I mean, again, like I tell people, you hit somebody in combat and they stand there and look at you, you realize, okay, I better get back to work here. I better figure this out, right?
Yep.
So then, you have to, the generation of power becomes a vital component. Whereas when you're only worried about what the judge thinks of your punch, the power is
Yeah.
irrelevant. It's irrelevant. The power is irrelevant. But when you have to hit someone and put them down, you want that power to be there. And the first time I met Lu Changyi, he said to me, it's amazing when he said it. He goes, his exact quote was, "We know karate had this power. What happened?"
Mhm.
That's what he
Yeah.
said. What happened? And my two answers were World War II and sport.
Yeah. It's
Because a
both
lot of
valid.
Yeah, I mean, because I think a lot of information probably disappeared, you know, both written and, knowledge of instructors, people dying, right? Because you look at how many of the famous masters passed away shortly after World War
Yeah.
II, you know?
Well, even Keanu's on that list too.
Right,
And
right,
who knows how much longer he could have lived? Because he
right,
could have got another 20 years.
right. I mean, because he was young, right, when he passed away?
I think he was like 60,
Right. Well, look at
which I mean,
look at Tatsuo.
yeah,
And part of that too is, and I mean, he had some type of stroke or aneurysm, where, but again, I mean, Marines probably bringing him alcohol from the mess,
yeah,
probably bringing him smokes from the mess. I'm sure that didn't help. I think, and I discussed this with McCarthy there that, stroke is a problem on Okinawa. It's a problem it seems to be a problem within the Asian race,
yeah.
that there's more likelihood of stroke. Uh,
Even my sensei, he had a really bad stroke in 2012.
right. Yeah. Gakia Sensei had a stroke,
Yeah,
confined to a wheelchair. I mean, Angi Uezu, you know the story with Angi Uezu, right?
yeah, yeah,
And you know what he did, right? He was told he'd never walk again and he'd never use his left arm again.
yeah,
I know someone who was with him when he had the stroke as a female student. He sent her from the hospital. He sent her to the hardware store to get a rope, and he tied a rope around his wrist and he had to throw it over the top. And from day one, he started pulling his left arm up with his other
Mhm.
hand and started getting the motion with that arm. And I trained with him pre-stroke and I trained with him post-stroke. And obviously there was a difference. How could there not be?
Yeah.
But I was amazed at how he came back from that stroke and
Hmm.
how he could still do karate and do it pretty well. So again, I think too, it's the willpower has a lot to do with it, right? So
Yeah.
is your teacher still teaching?
He is.
Yeah.
Actually, at the moment, he's not. He broke his hip a few weeks ago.
What'd he break? Oh, his
His
hip.
hip.
Oh,
Yeah. So Toyama Sensei is 89 years old,
okay.
so a little bit older. There was like a log that kind of floated up on the beach because he has a beach area behind his
Okay.
house. And he went over it and he overcompensated for how far the drop off was on the other side and just came down hard on it and like snapped it kind of up high. So he just had a hip replacement surgery. But when I was talking to him, he's like, "Oh yeah, yeah, no, we're gonna work on this and this and this in a few weeks." It's just
Yeah,
like
well, it's
you need to
amazing.
recover.
So, my wife being a doctor, I mean, she was telling me at one point that it's changing month to month.
Yeah,
Like literally the technology is changing month to month. Like my mother, when she was alive, she had a pacemaker defibrillator.
yeah,
And I mean, they replaced it, I think, twice. And each time they replaced it, like when they showed her the size of it,
he's getting
she's like,
smaller and smaller.
yeah. And my wife says too, the materials they're using now for the hips, the knees, everything's changing. Um, the way they do it now, the technology, it's amazing how fast it's going.
Yeah,
You are,
yeah. Well,
you were in your incident, right?
I just had a surgery on my knee about 2 weeks ago.
Okay,
Well, 3 weeks ago now. Um, Essentially, there were screws that they'd used before that are like not what they would use now. So they didn't change out the piece itself, but they took all the like the screws that attached to everything
right.
and re-put
Replace
like
those.
new. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy what they do now. You
What's
know,
crazy is in Japan they don't knock you out for surgeries like that. So they give you like an epidural, and I'm like laying there watching it on the screen, and the
right?
guy's just kind of digging through there doing his thing. I'm
Yeah,
like, this
it's
is
certain things it's amazing now certain things they do. I mean I
yeah,
mean I had my shoulder, I had an impingement in my shoulder and I had the surgery. Jesus, it's probably 20 years ago now, right? And sometimes when I'm asked like if I'm going to a new doctor for some reason and they say what surgeries have you had? And I go I had shoulder surgery and he'll say, "Well, which shoulder?" And I literally got to sit there for a second because I can't I haven't had a problem at all in so many years. I
yeah,
sometimes gotta try remember which shoulder I had the surgery on. Yeah, it's just amazing now with what they're able to do. I mean, you had your knee replaced, right? Because you were in
yep,
your Humvee got blown up in Iraq, right?
yep,
So, it's crazy. It's just amazing what they do now. I mean, my one student had both his knees replaced in New York, still
mhm.
practicing, still doing everything. So yeah, it's impressive. You know,
Well, what's crazy to me is even some of these guys who have like back fusions and they're still able to practice.
yeah,
It's just like, yeah, it's
yeah,
like you start thinking about mechanics of it and you're like,
right.
it makes sense because, even if the hip rotates, but the spine isn't, it's like,
But
it
now
still
now
falls
they're
in
e-
mechanics.
now they're even replacing vertebrae.
Yep.
It's crazy. The stuff. I mean, again, like me and my wife the other day, we were sitting there going, just think about what we've seen change in our lifetime.
Yeah.
So we were somewhere and there was a rotary phone. And my grandson was like, "What's that?"
Yeah.
Right? And me and my wife look at each other and go, What's that?" Right? Like, And then like with these cell phones, like I can't remember anybody's number anymore.
Yeah. Same.
But I still remember my first phone number from when I was a kid because you
Yeah.
had to memorize all those things and you had to remember them. So it's just interesting how even in our lifetime, the things that have changed, it's phenomenal. I mean, look at what we're doing right now. You're in
Mhm.
Okinawa. I'm sitting here in Arizona, and it's like we're sitting next to each other here.
Yep.
And I mean, this was unheard of like probably 10 years ago. you
Yeah.
know. And now I'm doing it with people all over the world, right? So it's just amazing. So
Well, like back in the day, we used to do VTCs for the military.
right,
So the video teleconferences,
right,
it used to not be like you could do it with your phone or your computer. You had to have like a whole suite, like
right,
special equipment, and it
right.
would
A
cost,
camera, you had to have a camera. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's like,
yeah.
like $500,000 set up for the room
Right,
so you
right,
can have a 10-minute meeting with somebody.
right. And now I hit a button, start the meeting, and boom, we're both
Exactly.
in, and that's it. And it's crazy. It's clear. Yeah, it's amazing. So get Scott's book, Ryuhoryu. Okay. Don't be fooled by the title. It's not just about the martial art he teaches. It's got a lot to offer for everybody. I highly recommend it. I've said it before. I feel like I'm in a golden age of martial arts research. Between yourself, uh, you know, obviously Patrick McCarthy, the guy that pretty much started it all, Andreas Quast, now some of the younger guys coming up, Yannick Schultz, I mean, Andy Sloan, just all these different people that are doing this research. Obviously, Motobu Naoki, I mean, another one. It's just fantastic. And for me, who, again, I love the history, I love to read about it. It's not my main focus, right? So
Mhm.
I don't, claim to be, it's like I'm the armchair historian, right? So I'm off the backs of you guys that are doing the more serious research. But even I was discussing with Pat McCarthy your book,
Mhm.
and he said right off the bat, he said that first part of that book, just the first part, is well worth the purchase. And I said 100%. I mean, if you want to know really the history of Okinawa and how that history all ties into karate, this book it really makes it clear. So again, I'm very happy you wrote the book. I was very happy when you were nice enough to give me a copy in Okinawa, which I started on the plane on the way back. Um, and again, I'm gonna let it sit for a little bit, but I'll be going through and reading that historical section time and time again. I mean, I could just see it. It's fantastic. So
Mhm.
the book's available on Lulu, right?
It
And
should
it's
be
go
on Amazon soon.
Okay, so hopefully it'll be on Amazon soon. I'll put a link in the description for Lulu, and as soon as it comes out on Amazon, let me know, and I'll
Okay.
blast that out. I'll blast that out to all the subscribers to the channel. I can send out a message and let them know that it's available on Amazon, and yeah, I couldn't highly recommend it more. And this will be a great week for me. I've got you this week, and I'm supposed to have Mario McKenna on next Friday. So I'll be talking to
There
him
you go.
next Friday and talk about some of the things he's done, the books he's translated, and his new book that he just came out with. So it should be pretty good. But I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
are there more books in the future, you think?
I don't know because I just finished this one, so it's like
Okay.
I'm kind of taking a breather,
Right.
but maybe because I thought about maybe expanding just on that history section and doing a whole book of that just by itself.
That'd be good.
But it's one of these things that after 5 years of working on one project, you just kind of want to take a breather for a bit.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when I asked Thomas Feldman what's next, he kind of gave me the same answer.
Yeah.
He said, literally, I just finished this and I'm burnt out. And he says, I got to take a break. I said, okay, but take a break, but start thinking about what, because again, for me, it's selfish, right?
Yeah.
Right. It's selfish. I get to read what you guys do, put the work into, right? And hopefully
Yeah.
with the channel, I can promote it a little bit and hopefully you'll sell some books and get more people exposed to the book, which will be good, right? So this way people will write more books, right? But
Well,
yeah,
I'm
I
trying
think it's
to
great.
really make sure that like a lot of the old history of it is actually taught correctly. Because you saw the whole section in there about the Chusa Theater Company.
Right. Right.
That is a big problem. And most of the stories that people are still saying today come from those or come from that theater company and not from historical fact.
Well, it's the same thing in China.
Yeah.
You had these acrobatic troops that were doing martial arts stuff. And what people don't realize is a lot of the martial arts came out of those performances.
Yep.
And again, we want to, like I'm constantly joking around with the Koru. Almost every Koru has some divine inspiration, right?
Yes. Or it
And
came
so
from Tengu.
Right. And and again in the Chinese arts and all of us want this kind of unique history, right? This unique founding thing, right? I mean, look, Ishinru, right? The vision he had, the dream he had, whatever it is. I mean, it makes it interesting, right? So it makes you pay a little bit of attention to it, right? But but again, I think the real history to me is just as fascinating as the stuff that's not so real, you know.
Yeah.
Um, I think we want to keep it real, So yeah, I agree. Like I read last year a book on Chinese martial arts history written by a professor from New York City.
Mhm.
It was very straightforward. Like he said, like, okay, I hate to burst your bubbles, but all these arts, none of them are very old, right?
Yeah.
Meaning, like, they're just not, right? And that's not a knock. He goes, but everything up until a certain point was battlefield combat.
Yeah.
So it's not these solo exercises. It's not these arts, these modern arts that we see now. And I think that's true of all these things we're doing.
Yep.
So yeah, I think the real history is important. So yeah, I mean, I think a book on that would be fascinating. You know, I mean, if you tied it all in with the Ryukyu house and exactly what was going on there, and I'm just saying, it's a fascinating subject. And
Mhm.
again, for guys like us, I'm sure when you started karate, you were told the same thing. Oh yeah, farmers made it,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
again, it sounds cool, right? But again, coming from New York, I don't meet too many farmers. But then,
Right.
now I live in Arizona and people don't realize there's a huge farming community in Arizona, like right near me.
Mhm.
When you see these people are out there all day in these fields working, like when did they have time to create a fighting art?
Exactly.
You know?
Well, great examples with the sai, right? I actually
Right,
have the photo in there from the 1800s with the cops holding the sai.
right,
Like,
right,
how is this not law enforcement?
right. 100%. 100%. Right. Yeah. I mean, I have video on my channel of Shimizu Takagi from Shindo Musaru Jodo
Hmm.
teaching jute techniques to the police department. It's on my
Yep.
channel, right? And yeah, so yeah, these things, they came out of, real stuff. Not
Yep.
not two farmers sitting around going, "Hey, what would you do if I throw a punch at you like this?" Come
What
on.
if I had this much metal? What could I make?
Right, right. So listen, I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, no
All
worries,
right.
man.
And we got to do this again. And again, if you, find something out and you decide, hey, I'd like to bring this up and talk about this, you know, feel free to come on. The door is always open. I mean, I want to give as many people that are doing good work a platform as possible. I don't want to
I appreciate that.
I don't want to play favorites here, you know. So,
Yeah.
all right. All right, so thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Hi, no
All right.
problem.
Take care.
Talk with you later, man. Yep.
Hope you enjoyed that interview with Scot Mertz. I enjoyed talking to him. It was great meeting him on Okinawa on my recent trip. It was the first time we'd met. He actually accompanied me to Tatsuo Shimabuku's Haka, his gravesite in Okinawa, which I really appreciated. He was nice enough to give me a copy of his book, which again, I highly recommend. His book, Ryuhoryu, okay? Highly recommend it. Great book. Hope you enjoyed it. And next week, I think we're going to have an interview, hopefully, with Mario McKenna, another author. So if you like this, please hit that like button, subscribe, consider becoming a member, share the videos, all right? Helps with that dreaded YouTube algorithm that we're all trying to, figure out a way how to use better, all right? So again, take care. I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you in the next podcast.